Cybersecurity expert Dr. Arun Vishwanath here with us with more. Thanks so much for coming on. Can you talk a bit more about some of the misinformation that's being spread online and how it has directly or indirectly affected the conflict in the Middle East?
Hey, Jill, it's great to be here. This has been a game of catch-up for social media. This is completely new territory. Every conflict is unique in its own form. And in this particular case, we're seeing, both sides. We're seeing, an amplification of misinformation, of just fake news on both sides. And we're seeing problems not just in the conflict areas. We're seeing problems right now, even in the United States. We're seeing it in India. We're seeing it everywhere because, the reach of the social media platforms and this conflict, divides people in a lot of different places. This isn't just limited now to, these conflict areas. I mean, these historically used to be limited, but now it's kind of spread all over the world.
So how are social media companies responding? Are they taking posts down if they have misinformation? It doesn't seem like it, just as somebody who uses social media.
Yeah, this is a very hard one, right? I mean, every conflict, we're learning something new. COVID, social media learned something new. To give them credit, there's just the volume of what they're dealing with is a lot. We're talking about billions and billions of pages, and every one of them. And when I say everyone, Facebook is doing its own thing with Instagram and WhatsApp. The others are doing it too. Twitter is doing it, but it's just not enough, right? Because the rate at which this thing happens, right? You have a conflict that begins, and you have literally hours to respond. I'll tell you, just to give you an example of something that happened, for a little while, Instagram blocked the hashtag Alaska, which they believed was a terrorist organization, but it's the third most popular Islamic place of worship. And that caused a whole ruckus. So even the content moderators have a hard time moderating this content because there's humongous differences in just the linguistic nuances that we're dealing with here. There are differences in just what people are sharing and historical skepticism. So, and there really isn't a voice of reason that you can interject. So generally, when we talk about how do you deal with this, there are four pillars to this, right? I mean, one of it is let's, quickly get back into the news cycle and put in the right news. I mean, that's very hard to do when you have so much skepticism and animosity between people. The second is, blog content. Now that takes time, especially with COVID, people working out of homes. And let's be honest, I mean, there are so many languages in these areas that we're dealing with that it's going to be very hard to keep on top of this. So we're talking about pages coming up, pages going down, but more new ones coming. And then there are these mistakes that happen. And this actually riles up these bases even more. So, trying to come up with this balance between, free speech and content moderation, this is not an easy one. This is not something that I think we're stress tested these technologies for. So, I empathize with some of these organizations, with the media organizations, but hey, we're right now in the front of a war where they have to do more. So I get the other side of that too. We got to do more because lives are being lost.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've seen this huge uptick in anti-Semitism here in the United States with attacks on Jewish people who were just walking down the street. How is social media playing into that? Do you think that social media has made it worse?
Absolutely. It makes it even worse because remember, this comes from people you trust, right? The way this works is this amplification happens because it goes to a lot of people from people they trust. So this misinformation comes from sources you trust, and they're usually emotion-laden. So there's a lot of emotion in this. That's what makes this spread like wildfire. And then they feed right into that historical animus that people have against people of the Jewish faith, going back to almost 100, 200, even longer from biblical times on. And so, one of these things that happens is we're starting to see an uptick in anti-Semitism everywhere. And here's where I think the social media companies can do a better job. I can understand the limits of a conflict area, but when it comes to local areas, and when I mean local, in the United States, in Europe, they've got to do a better job. It's got to be much more proactively done because now you don't have those same linguistic differences. So it's way easier to block these things. It's way easier to interject the correct news. And I think that's where they're failing.
So why aren't they? I mean, it seems like such an obvious thing. I have seen the most vile anti-Semitic political cartoons and language on social media, and I have thought, how is this allowed to still be up? And I'm not saying that it doesn't exist on the other side as well. I'm just wondering, why don't these social media platforms do something about it?
Well, part of the reason is, one, when we say social media, we're talking about this huge gamut of different entities, right? I mean, so let's take it something like WhatsApp or Telegram. I mean, these are end-to-end, and they're encrypted end-to-end. So these companies don't really see the content. All they're seeing is the meta tags in them or the metadata in them. So it's kind of a little harder to do it. So if you notice what WhatsApp has done, if you're using WhatsApp, for the viewers who've used WhatsApp, I mean, they've added friction to it. So they made it harder to share. They're putting warnings on them. And they're hoping that, people use their sensibilities, right? That you deliberate on the content that you get on WhatsApp. However, people don't really do that. Most people don't really read beyond that, headline and the byline. And when they're angry and they're skeptical of something, and it feeds right into their political biases, they share it faster than the media can take it out. So one of the problems is the technology itself. Facebook is a little different, right? Twitter is a little different. Now they have the content and they're taking it down, but we're talking about billions of pages. So sometimes there is a lag, and that lag could be a few hours to a few days. That's too long in today's conflicts. And that's why we're seeing these things pop up even as fast as they're taking it down.
It seems like there's just never going to be a solution to this, because as you say, there's just too many posts, too many different languages. They're always kind of playing whack-a-mole or catch-up.
That's right.
So is there an answer, or is it, what do you do? Are lawmakers, is it pressure from lawmakers for these social media companies? What can be really done here?
Well, and the answer to that depends, right? It depends on which country we're talking about. And we're having a hard time doing it in our own nation, where we have all those forces coming together. We have lawmakers getting interested in it. We have the technology companies vested in it and have a local base here. So even here, it's hard to do it because, again, we come into this, intersection between free speech and harm, right? How do we restrict something that might be on the fringe of free speech? I mean, we're having issues with that here and volume. So until we can figure it out in the United States, it's going to be very hard for us to say, hey, how are we going to solve this at a global level? And remember, even if we solve it with one platform, there are alternatives that keep coming up. There is a Telegram that comes up, and there is another one that comes up. So this is a game of whack-a-mole until, and I've always said this, and every time I talk about this, we have got to all be vested. It's our responsibility. It's not just the active spreader. It's the passive receiver. You and I, our audiences, we've got to do a better job and say, hey, you know what? This is fake news, or this doesn't sound right. And until we can get to that point, I think this is going to continue. The technology companies are going to do their best, but it's never going to be good enough.
It's such a great point. We all have to just kind of, I think, be a little skeptical about everything that we see and read online. Really great to have you on this morning. Cybersecurity expert, Dr. Arun Vishwanath. Appreciate your time.